So, good evening, everybody. So, of course, very nice to be back again here in San Francisco. If this is still part of San Francisco, the journey of almost 2.5 hours that we took, I think we took the round of the ocean today, surrounded by San Francisco, I think, in some ways. It was an interesting day. Getting here was very interesting this morning. Starting from yesterday, actually, when I was told that the tickets were not going to happen. Then this morning, I seem to have left my passport behind. Then after that, what happened? We had a bumpy flight. Then our car almost broke down coming here on the freeway. And I think so far, we are here. So in that way, it was a nice journey. Long one, but interesting. And I'm very, very happy to be here. The last times that I was here, I had the very pleasure, great happiness of meeting with many of my friends, some of whom are here, and from the Shambhala Center, as well as from many other centers. This time particularly, it is a visit that I have looked forward to this year, especially because of our great respect for Tulku Rinpoche, one of my teachers, as well as his entire family, Choling Rinpoche, Tsonyi Rinpoche, Pajo Rinpoche, and all the Rinpoches of the family. And then, of course, this particular place. I have just arrived here, and it looks beautiful to be so accessible to the people living in a city, and yet to have such a large space of practice. And that's extremely beneficial for all sentient beings, and then particularly when it is under the guidance of such a teacher as Jetsun Rinpoche, then it certainly becomes Padmasambhava's place of practice. And so it's a great delight, of course, to meet many of you who have had the fortunate possibility of studying with so many great teachers. And then today, in a time where spiritual practices have become much more accessible than it was many years ago. And so transition and transformation has taken place over the many years. It's not only Buddhism, but all philosophies, all different kinds of religions and doctrines have evolved, have adapted, have contributed in making and bringing a lot of awareness, a lot of wisdom, and that's all very good. I think no one more than the people living in California would probably, particularly in today's time, know more about the benefits and the fortunate circumstances and possibilities that arises from non-sectarian, interreligious communication, contribution, sharing among one another. And Buddhism, although most of us, I'm assuming that many of you are connected to one lineage or the other of the Buddhist teachings. Some of you may not be particularly referring to yourselves as Buddhist meditators, but the bad habit of a Tibetan teacher is that we keep assuming everyone is a Buddhist and then go about saying the things that we need to say. And so from that perspective, the connection with spiritual practices that are there in today's time, as I was saying, bring tremendous benefit. And from that perspective, one could say the Buddhist teachings have contributed in some ways, particularly in the last 50 years, and through the efforts of many, many teachers who have taught, not only Tibetan teachers, but teachers from other Buddhist traditions. And now today, perhaps a larger part of that contribution coming from Buddhist practitioners and teachers of Western origin, and so whom we refer to as Western teachers, although in terms of introduction or having some designation, we do refer to them as Westerners because they're born in the West. But from the perspective of understanding and their work and the way they have understood Dharma, philosophy of Buddhism, exceptional, deepened understanding is there, and therefore parallel to all the contribution of all the various teachers, their contribution is also remarkable in today's times. And so, from the East, from the West, but most particularly the deepened contribution of teachers who have chosen to live here and completely devote their life to propagating the teachings of Buddha, being able to really share their wisdom and understanding has, I think, benefited tremendously. Then under the guidance of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, his accessibility, his ability to really talk and teach the profound teachings in the most simplest way that can and has at the bottom the genuine intention to really benefit all human beings. All of these has brought about a much more wider and a deepened understanding of Buddhism today. Then together with that, the contribution of many translators, Tibetans who speak English and Westerners who speak Tibetan language, Sanskrit scholars, and therefore a lot of translations and works are now available. 20, 30 years ago, you went into a bookshop, very rarely would one find Buddhist books, and even so, there were a lot more imagination, Shangri-La, Shambhala, all those far-off lands, and for a sort of storybook kind of was much more there. And some remarkable translation works were there, but languages that seemed like from Mars, and one couldn't really understand them very well. And in the last 10, 15 years, a lot has changed in that respect. And today you walk into boutiques, especially if it is Dharma Center bookstores, and also in regular bookstores, a lot of books are there available. All of this has led to Buddhism not any longer requiring any introduction. And it has become something that most people have understood. Those who have deepened their connection with the Buddhist teachings perhaps have a different approach or a different way of relating to it and have studied the sequential topics of meditation and understanding what the philosophy is. And then those who are still hesitant or skeptic or still new and beginning into the search of what Buddhism means or philosophy means, may have also understood according to whatever their approach and interests might be. And so from that perspective, some may relate to Buddhism as art of or compassion, or some sense of art of happiness, or some philosophy, meditation, yoga, some kind of transcendental meditation to form meditation, formless meditation, depending upon whatever one's own connection might be, one's understanding about Buddhism might be so. And so if we see it from this perspective, Buddhist tradition and teachings have become widespread. At the same time, if we compare it to the contribution of other major religions and philosophies of the world, Buddhism is a very small part of it. And so it requires all of us to begin to understand the importance of seeing the presence of different religions. Often we don't do that. And as one of the very foremost teachers of Buddhism, Patrul Rinpoche, many of you may know, has always given remarkable, clear examples. And one of the examples in the context of teachers, he talks about a frog living in a well. And so a frog whose entire life has been spent in the well often assumes that the well is the entire universe. And there's an old Tibetan anecdote and a story that goes with this frog who lived in the well and thought the universe of that well. One day, his friend from a friend frog from the ocean came to visit him. And they went into a conversation as the story goes. And then this frog from the well asked this frog who had come from the ocean how big an ocean is. And so the frog from the ocean tried to explain how big an ocean might be. But this frog from the well refused to believe him. And so there's a story which goes and he says, is it 1/3 of my well? And he said, the other frog from the ocean said, no, much, much bigger. And he said, perhaps half of this well of mine. And then again the other frog says, no, much, much, much bigger. And then he says, 3 parts of this well. Couldn't be more than that. There isn't any such thing possibly bigger than this well of mine. And so this frog from the ocean, how much ever he tried to convince this frog from the well that the ocean is limitless, it's very, very big, much, much bigger than his own well, this frog from the well became very, very hurt and very offended that this guest of his would dare to come into his well and then say that his ocean is bigger than his well. And so finding it very difficult to convince him, this frog from the ocean decided to extend an invitation to the frog from the well to come and visit his home, the ocean. And so it is said that the frog from the well went one day to visit his friend from the ocean, chanced upon the first glance at the ocean, and had a heart attack and died. And his heart couldn't stand the fact that there was something bigger than his well. That's quite also similar to what we sometimes tend to do. Buddhism is the entire world, or Christianity is the entire world, or Jainism is the entire world, Islam is the entire world, Hinduism is the entire world. Not being able to clearly see the essence of the teachings and the reasons why any philosophy or doctrine originated, we often choose to go much more into the form of what we think should religions be and what we expect it to be like. I don't think we particularly intend it that way. There might be groups of people who might intentionally jump into such a conclusion. But for most of us, particularly from a Buddhistic perspective, one would say basic sanity and the humanness of one's own self, the individual humanness of one's own self, is not particularly bad or negative. That there is always a strong affinity, a strong connection to something that is positive, whether it is a selfish positiveness in the sense that it may be happiness for oneself, liking good weather versus bad weather, liking one's children, loving one's spouses, seeing something beautiful and nice and longing for it or liking it very much versus distaste and dislike for things that are harmful or negative. Although it may be particularly not for others, but there may be a much more selfish approach requiring that love and happiness for one's own self, trying to refrain from encountering difficulties in one's own self. Nevertheless, basic characteristic of a person, individual human being, shows that the intrinsic nature of a human being is good. There is an appreciation of something that is good, pure, gentle, and cause of happiness. There is regret, there is remorse, there is anxiety and fear and detachment and wanting to renounce and abstain, stay away from that which causes unhappiness and is negative, is impure, something that we all know. It's a different story that we don't always end up in the same way, but in terms of liking and disliking, it's clear that does direct the person to understand easily, each of us to understand easily, basic nature of the person does like something that is positive, that is good. Now, although that positive goodness is inside of one's own self, and based upon that positiveness, one could say that most of our confusion or any kind of ignorant attitudes that we do develop, ignorant attitudes such as seeing one's own philosophy as better than the other, or even if that is not so, at least becoming so focused in one's own form of the practices, form of the philosophy or the doctrine, and becoming so very engrossed in the form, the outer form itself, that we tend to ignore the fact that we may have moved away from the essence of what philosophy or any practice, methods of teachings, direct our mind to understanding. And so from that perspective, where today world situation, particularly in the modern world, where spirituality is spread, widespread, and people do benefit a lot from that, but there's always the tendency to maybe mistakenly go more towards the form of the practices rather than understanding the true essence of the practices. And so eventually, if that is not what we address in our practices as individuals, as group of people on the path of the practice, occasions such as your being here, myself being here, and other occasions similar to this, during these times, if in the beginning itself we do not address this issue, then eventually we may become good Buddhists, loyal meditators, maybe perfect meditators from the outer perspective. But the chaos, the confusion, and the turmoil of our own emotions that continually is what we are trying to free ourselves from doesn't bring about much changes. Not much changes happen. And so I often talk about my own little experience, if we say, part of it is living in the monasteries and the, let's say, the retreat centers. Now, from where you are sitting, one would sometimes think, nowadays maybe people are much more aware of the situation since many of you have been in that condition yourself. But there used to be a time when people thought anyone living in monasteries and the retreats are all enlightened people. If not enlightened, then at least free from much of the defilements that are there. But if you knew what happened inside, particularly among the renunciates, it's an entirely different story. And so, particularly if it is a retreat center for women, then it becomes even more interesting. One of the things would be is where I come from. It's supposed to be in the mountains and far away from all the chitter-chatter. When we were looking for the place for the retreat, the main criteria everyone wanted was far away from all the communities, the noise. This has to be an isolated place of practice, protected for all women. And we thought, very good. So we went into this nice Himalayan mountain there, which is a nice place of practice. But then over the years, now it's almost 10 years since the retreat center began. Now I'm not saying that all of the ones who are from the retreat center are the same kind, but it's a good example. And it's always safer to give examples of one's own home, probably. We can solve the problem much more easily that way. But when a person goes into retreat, and probably not only something say the retreat for women's, but almost everywhere. And those of you who have done retreats in Buddhist places, now I don't know about the others, but I think it's the same too. I spent about 11 years in a Catholic convent, and it was not so much better either, I think, although we were small at that time and wasn't so much into the politics of it. But at the same time, if we see, people take great preparations. They prepare 1 year or many more years than that in readiness to go into retreat of renunciation. And you hug your families and you cry and you have all the farewell parties and you sell your car and you let your job go. And then you receive all the transmissions. You make this whole journey from the West to India and other places. From among them, they all come. And then there is this big celebration and feast, and teachers come and do the blessings, and empowerments are given, and people go into retreat. First day is calm, second day is calm. Then 2 weeks, 3 weeks. Then from each retreat room begins a different performance every day. From bigger issues to small issues about vessels, if there is one common kitchen, then about utensils, where a certain retreatant might have put coffee in one utensil and the other person only drank herbal tea, but cannot make that herbal tea because now the pot smells of coffee. Or the person who switches the light on at 4 o'clock in the morning, whereas this person couldn't sleep with the light on and wanted this person to switch it on at 4:15. Small things. But for a person who's a retreat master, it's a lifetime's work trying to keep peace. Among these retreatants who have renunciated, the whole samsara here in this case, are out to benefit sentient beings, but are going through these gross emotional turmoils of every kind. And eventually, the second or the third month or so, you just can't stand this person next to you. And this person, he or she, is out of the category of sentient beings completely. So from that perspective, sometimes I sit down and think, I wish these people had never met Buddhism. Would probably have become much more saner person. You'd have to sit down and sometimes think, what are we doing? What are we doing here? And so that's very essential for everyone to understand. For a while, spiritual journey can be entertaining. And for most of us, we try to do our best. One part of it is even when we display all these neurotic tendencies, nevertheless, there is also a lot of effort. We can't say there is no effort at all. Of the 15 minutes of complaining that they may do and shouting matches that they have among themselves, one can say 20, 21 hours they do try to spend generating compassion for others and so on and so forth. There's a good part to it too, but simply because as an analogy as we are using. On the other hand, what does bring about is the attitude that is there that we often bring about in spiritual practices. And so, optimistically speaking, positive way of looking at it would be is something good is being done. There is always some benefit. And comparatively, one could always say, in comparison to not doing anything, a superficial, fabricated way of meditating perhaps is better. It at least keeps you out of trouble for 15 minutes, even if it is a sense of fabricated meditation happening. But on the other hand, if we look at the true potential of what meditation can do, then you have to ask the question, am I really able to enter into it? And therefore, that comes to a point where we have to ask the question some days. What often comes up in discussions among practitioners is, are we going to always talk about enlightenment as being something of the past, read about it as happening among teachers and enlightened beings of the past in the books of history? And even so, while we see many of our teachers as enlightenment among our Sangha members, among our own selves, and particularly in one's own self, how much development, how much changes are happening in one's own self. Indeed, as a Buddhist practitioner, we practice with the intention to benefit all sentient beings. But then on the other hand, even if we are not able to do it, some small changes and transformation should occur in one's own self. That's the aspiration we all hold. And oftentimes boredom or laziness, distraction, or dejection and disappointment in practices do come about because we don't necessarily see those changes happening in our own selves. As is the nature, particularly in the West, there's a very optimistic outlook in which people tend to use colorful language and in a way trying to inspire one another. And we know that it's somewhat like the dust that we sweep under the carpet and lumps begin to show, but at the same time we use a lot of adjectives to say it's terrible, but there's a good thing about it. This is very bad, something that shouldn't happen about it, and there was this great disaster, but it was a great learning experience. I always admire, in many ways, Tibetans don't tend to do that. A problem is always a problem. But what I find very interesting in the last 13 years or so of coming to America is how people do try, especially Buddhists and spiritual practitioners, try to keep a very optimistic outlook. And they talk about the most disastrous of the things, then ended up with, but it was a great learning experience, or that it was very positive. Everyone fell down and broke apart. They had massive fights among themselves. The center no longer exists, but it was great. It was a great experience. So for a Tibetan, it's a little bit confusing to see. I don't think that's a very good thing that happened there in that sense. But that same habit we sometimes bring into our own practices. We don't see the changes, but we try to avoid the issue altogether because we think this is lacking in devotion. It's not having confidence in the path of practices. Anger remains the same, ego remains the same, chaotic tendencies and grasping and attachment remains the same. Basically, not much changes are occurring. Grasping and attachment, strong attachment to self is still there. Less compassion. Genuine transcendence of one's own grasping has not occurred, but we think there may be hope. Maybe something has occurred, but I don't know about it. Or we avoid the issue altogether and become very devoted meditators and practitioners. We keep an optimistic outlook. In some cases, that may be all right. But then is the same thing, a problem that is swept under the carpet again and again, again and again, distances oneself from the genuine understanding of the teachings. And from the Buddhist perspective, one talks about the first thing, which is impermanence. Impermanence is there. Changes occur all the time. External phenomenal changes in the form of seasons. Just looking at a tree and you find every season changes that occur to a tree. We look at our own selves, we look at the people we know, and the changes that are occurring. Gross changes can be seen very easily. Subtle changes in our own body, subtle changes in our own attitude, in our own life, and the movement of time that is occurring at all times. That doesn't wait for one's own self. And therefore, from that perspective, as anyone connected to any path of practice, particularly any spiritual practice, that is being done with the intention to help oneself and to help others, must be examined thoroughly and carefully. That's a responsibility everyone has. A person who is new, beginning in meditation of any kind, any philosophy, can examine simply so that if you have entered that path of practice to benefit from it, benefit must arise. Otherwise, something is not happening that is right. You must question that. Foremost of all, Buddhist meditators who meditate not only for one's own self, but it is said with the right attitude and the right intention to truly bring about transcendence of mind that is able to liberate oneself and benefit all sentient beings. Then that is the intention with which we practice. It is said that a Buddhist meditator, the first thought that should come in the mind is that may this life be useful. Useful for oneself, useful for the others. On a relative perspective, whatever I do today, whatever I say today, whatever I think today, may it be for the benefit of all sentient beings. From the absolute perspective, may I realize the absolute truth, and through this, may liberation arise in the lifetime of all sentient beings and one's own self. If that is the first thought that arises in the morning, it is the thought and the motivation that precedes any session of meditation, any teaching, any learning. If it is the very last thought that you should generate as you go to sleep, then that also means that we do have the responsibility of being on a path that will require oneself to be absolutely true to one's own motivation, to one's own commitment. To realize absolute truth and to be able to benefit sentient beings, if that being the aspiration, and yet what we tend to accumulate as the action, if it is a paradox, if it is in contradiction to that, then that is not going to produce any fruition of that aspiration. And we wonder why that change is not happening, why that transformation is not happening. And so from that perspective, examining carefully as a person beginning on path of meditation, as well as anyone who is on any path of practice, spiritual practices, particularly Buddhist practices, must be able to really look inward of one's own self and examine carefully how much the essence of the teachings and the philosophy that one is devoted to is what one is practicing in one's own lifetime. If that thorough investigation and examination is not carried out, then changes are not going to happen. If changes do not happen, that then again destabilizes one's own confidence and devotion to the path of practice. And it becomes much more easier for oneself to revert back to habitual ways of doing things, habitual ways of generating emotions, and all different kinds of obstacles, whether it is laziness, whether it is distraction, easily comes about. And so that comes into a way of saying, as meditators, what are we to do with our emotions? How are we going to benefit from the path of meditation and practice so that it can truly, if benefit all sentient beings, then that would be very good. But if not, then even the least that we could do is work with one's own self, one's own emotions. And so from that perspective, Buddhist meditations or Buddhist teachings often begin with the, let's say, effort or trying to generate awareness of what the teachings of Shakyamuni Buddha talk about. And so from that perspective, we could also say that given what we think we know about human nature being basic goodness, given also the intention to benefit others, and most importantly, given the fact that each human being has the ability to think and generate awareness, any particular form of practice or philosophy actually is not required. One of the facts is that Buddhism, the name itself, is contradictory to what its philosophy is about. If we think Buddhism has to be a designation or a name, the situation has evolved, and in not so long a time, 2,500 years in comparison to world history is a very short period of time. But within that short period of time, we've managed to give that absolute truth presented within the Buddhist philosophy as a very form-oriented philosophy too. And so, if we look carefully, especially those of you who've studied Buddhism, will find it talks about empty nature. It talks about not believing in anything other than the absolute truth, and that the absolute truth leads to understanding selflessness and emptiness. And I'll come back to that. But if it is also, from a cursory glance, if it is going to talk about the empty nature of self and phenomena, then such a philosophy cannot be form-oriented. Such a philosophy cannot be fixated upon the designation Buddhism too. But human nature being such that if one were to say absolute truth, probably for some it would be okay, but most of us would end up saying, what's the history of absolute truth? What's the geography of absolute truth? How can you say absolute truth is so and so? And we keep coming up with questions that need a reference. Our human habitual pattern is such that without a reference, without having something to hold and grasp and turn and twist, agree and disagree with, we simply can't go forward in the simplest of the ways. We have to try and find the simplest thing in the most complex manner, in the most complicated ways. And therefore, from that habit, if you ask a question, you get an answer. 84,000 emotions and the questions that we have come about are said to be the origin of the 84,000 tenets, trying to explain emptiness, trying to explain genuine kindness, selflessness. And therefore, if we say, why then within Buddhism, although it talks about the absolute truth, does it become a religion? Does it become a part of the practice? Or in much more simple ways, people often wonder, especially those who are newer into the path of the practice, talk about being able to understand the philosophy of selfless compassion and emptiness in Buddhism, but how about all the superstitions? How about all the forms in the practices, methods of practices? For example, when in the first years when many teachers came, but what I remember is 1987, 1989, the first times that I came to America, I clearly remember still groups of people saying, talk about Buddhism, not about culture of Tibetan Buddhism. Talk about just the essence of Buddhism. That has changed a little bit, but still there is a lot of questions still among people who talk about, well, we understand the philosophy of Buddhism, but when it comes to techniques of meditation, when it comes to especially visualizing 13-headed deities with fangs and drinking blood and cutting the throat and so on and so forth, can't really match between that awareness, loving kindness, compassion, and then the visualization of these 9-headed deities and so on and so forth. Now, if I go into the explanations of whys and wherefores, there's a whole long explanation, and perhaps I will win the debate in this case. But nevertheless, in some ways, if we see carefully, one does find that the origin of all the form that did come about came about because of blockages or hesitations and questions that we came up with. And so when the question comes up in trying to find reason, that reasoning is given a way of logic, a way of explanation, a way of expounding and instructing how it might come about. And so in some ways, one could say the beginning of trying to understand what the essence of Buddhism is, one could say silence. But having said it, and especially those of us who have spoken about it for an entire lifetime, it's the most perfect, and we do know, but the mind comes up with but how? Or but why? And so all these questions, the mind that comes up with all these questions, then has to be answered. And so the simple answer would be is, out of that questioning, out of the requirement of a reference, comes about also a philosophy based on emptiness and selflessness, as what we refer to as Buddhism, requiring there to be a teacher, requiring there to be a path, requiring there to be techniques and forms of meditation. And so oftentimes it is simply said to be that all the different levels, forms, and techniques of methods of meditation within the Buddhist teachings of Hinayana, Mahayana, and Vajrayana, what are referred to as the 3 yanas or the 3 vehicles, 3 main sequential progressive stages of practices and understanding the entirety of the Buddhist philosophy, are skillful methods. And therefore, Hinayana points more towards the discipline, awareness and mindfulness, learning about the emptiness of self. Mahayana goes much more deeper into understanding selflessness of phenomena, understanding of genuine love and compassion, and extending liberation and freedom from suffering, not only to one's own self, but extending it to all sentient beings. Vajrayana talks about nature, the absolute true nature of suchness, of the absolute true nature of mind, absolute true nature of phenomena. And so out of the emphasis on these 3 searches or understanding, evolution of Hinayana, Mahayana, and Vajrayana teachings have come about. But again, the mistaken path is that we get involved in the form of what Hinayana practices are, and we dutifully do the practices as it is done. Similarly, within Mahayana and Vajrayana teachings also, we do actually take on the path of the practices, often encountering, however, the difficulty of distancing ourselves from the actual transformation that should arise from within one's own self. And so discipline, we learn about all kinds of discipline. We learn about basic principle of discipline in Buddhism, 10 virtuous actions that should be adopted, 10 unvirtuous actions that should be abandoned. whether it is killing, stealing, or sexual misconduct, lying, harsh words, gossip, and slander, covetousness, ill intention, and wrong view, or not understanding cause and effect. These 10 unvirtuous actions which form the fundamental ethics and basis of Buddhism. Now, many of you have heard about it, so I've gone into a quick way of it, but open any Dharma book, you'll find the enumerations clearly. If you still find it, you can't count it in that way. So it simply would be avoiding all negative actions of body, avoiding all negative actions of speech, avoiding all negative intentions, and thought generations or mental conscious thoughts of harming somebody else, abandoning them. That's the foundation of Buddhist practices. Now, those of us who have meditated, then we should ask the question, how many times do you actually bring about the awareness? As quickly as I have enumerated, I could ask myself, having woken up this morning, almost missing my flight to being here, how many times did I actually think about 10 unvirtuous actions and cultivating the opposite, 10 virtuous actions? Truthfully speaking, not a single time. And so, sometimes we take sort of, again, console ourselves and say, oh yes, I did remember it during my prayers, or I did remember it during my meditation. But if we are really honest, as meditators, and many of you I know meditate, to be able to reflect upon and say, just as quickly as I am able to enumerate, having that wisdom in mind, how many times have I been able to generate that mindfulness? That truthfully I have been able to develop mindfulness of my speech, mindfulness of my actions, mindfulness of my intentions, of my thoughts. And therefore, as long as the genuine watching of one's own self and actions of body, speech, and mind, that characteristic, that quality is not able to develop, simply by being a dedicated practitioner, change and transformation is not going to happen. Shaving my hair, wearing red and maroon and yellow colors, that doesn't bring about much change. They're supposed to remind me 10 unvirtuous actions that need to be abandoned, 10 virtuous actions that need to be cultivated. Rather than doing that, I dutifully shave my hair and wear my robes. But on the other hand, when it comes to the essence that needs to be reminded, if I don't think about that, then we've separated from the essence of philosophy and the practices of meditation, and that same person turns around and says, what is it that is going wrong? It must be the philosophy that is wrong, because of which the neuroses still seem to be there. I still seem to suffer from aggression. I still suffer from attachment, from this desire, and so on and so forth. And therefore, again, Mahayana teachings talk about selfless compassion. And within selfless compassion, we talk about generosity, ethics, patience, diligence, meditation, and wisdom. 6 perfect actions, 6 paramitas, 6 disciplines of the greater vehicle Mahayana. Each Mahayana practitioner, and many of you are not only Mahayana but Vajrayana practitioners, have received enormous amount of teachings. But throughout the 24 hours of the day, how many times do we actually practice generosity? Generosity that is not attached to Buddhism. Generosity that doesn't have to come from any particular philosophy. It's a quality that existed a lot longer than any of the religions of the world. Loving kindness and compassion doesn't come from Buddhism. It's enumerated in the Buddhist philosophy, just as it is enumerated in any philosophy. But as long as human beings have had the awareness and the mindfulness, these qualities have always been there. We owe a great deal of gratitude to a lot of the enlightened teachers who actually said it in so many words, what we knew but couldn't be so very eloquent about. And therefore, someone gave the definition of what selfless compassion is. We owe our gratitude for that kindness. But to think that it didn't exist before someone actually pointed it out, that's not true, isn't it? And so from that perspective, whether we see it as human quality, whether we see, again, take great inspiration simply because the Buddha taught about it, if that makes us feel better and more enables us to put it into practice, then yes, Buddha talked about loving kindness and compassion. And that should generate the inspiration to put it into practice. But on the other hand, those of us who know and can enumerate them understand that to be the ethics, basis of ethics of any spiritual practice, need to ask our own selves, how many times do we actually bring it into practice? How much generosity, having become a Buddhist, if I take again myself as an example, being born in a Buddhist family, Probably the first words that or sounds that we heard were the longhorns and the different religious instruments and the chantings of the monks and so forth. Having been born in that, grew up in that environment, every day hearing or talking about generosity. But then in meditation, in contemplation, it becomes essential to sit down and then ask the question, knowing how to define it and talk about it for 2 hours or 3 hours every Saturday and Sunday, how much do I actually practice that generosity? In the same way, each meditator needs to do that. Loving kindness and compassion that we talk about so much. And especially as spiritual practitioners and meditators, profound conversation is what we are very good at. We can't down or drink a gulp of coffee without saying something profound to one another. That's who we have become as spiritual meditators. On the other hand, as we are so very able to talk about it, how much do we actually practice it? And then we again sit down and then sometimes wonder why the teachings, no matter how many hundred thousands of mantras one has recited, changes are not coming. That loving kindness still is becoming difficult to put into practice. Why the defilements, especially the 3 root poisons, or the 3 main defilements enumerated in Buddhism: desire, anger, and ignorance. 3 main causes of every confusion as it comes about. Why that's still not going through transformation, is decreasing, and selfless compassion still is very difficult to generate in our own selves. From that perspective, if we look at it in that way, although a Vajrayana, Mahayana, or a Hinayana practitioner that we may refer to ourselves, in actuality, we may have never entered the path of the doctrine. We may have never understood the Buddhist practices. Distinction between a Buddhist and a non-Buddhist is said to be one who is able to truly benefit and help all sentient beings, genuinely practice loving kindness towards all sentient beings, and one who is able to truly understand and commit oneself to the immense responsibility of creating actions all the time. And so from that perspective, body continues to perform actions and we generate that. Speech continues to perform actions and we continue to generate that action. Mind continues to generate thoughts and we continue to produce thoughts. And so from the perspective of being Buddhist, then cause and effect, karma is continuously there. Karma, I don't think, is a difficult topic, although some tend to still have difficulties with it, but it's simple, law of cause and effect. Any action that you do has a result, produces a result. Results don't have to necessarily be about previous births and afterlife, life after death and so forth. One does not have to believe in birth and rebirth in order to understand karma. If we can be responsible for the karma of this lifetime, that's itself a great achievement. From that perspective, simple law of cause and effect would be is that actions that we do produce from our body, speech, and mind begin to affect us and has effects on the lives of the others. What I say meets, interacts. That action affects and interacts other people's lives. What I say, what I think, affects the lives of the others. The environment is created because of my actions. Just as my environment often changes and is affected by the attitudes and the action and the speech of the others, I have the power also of producing actions of body, speech, and mind that affects the lives of the others, that shapes and conforms the environment that we are in. If not about interacting with the others, our own selves, who I have become as a person today, is the result of my karma, is the result of my actions. Karma is actions. Therefore, each action that I perform, some actions that are big and much more, let's say, deep and more subtle and have much more deeper impact, to certain actions that have less impact. Nevertheless, like sediments that settle at the bottom of the lake, similar to that, actions that I perform begin to shape and conform that form of the person. The characteristic of this person, my individual self, is influenced by my actions of the body. What I say and what I speak often through my own ignorance, I may tend to believe that they do not affect the lives of the others or do not shape or affect my own self, but that's simple ignorance. What I say and what I end up saying through my own speech affects others, but most importantly, also determines the person that I am going to be. shapes my thinking, demonstrates my thinking. And therefore, thoughts is equally the same. We generate hundreds and thousands of thoughts every day. And each of these thoughts we think have been generated, that they are not stored at any level. But often again, that same thought performed by my speech, by my body, and in the forms of my own mental stream of emotions shape my attitude. I am the person, a product of the actions that I have created from my body, speech, and mind. So the body, speech, and mind creates action. That action has a repercussion. It comes and affects my own self, and I go back and forth, producing these actions, each action becoming a result. And at the end, this heap of all my thoughts, of my speech, of my actions, begins to become this identity of this person. This identity of the person continues to perform that actions that affects the lives of the others, and therefore interaction between self and the others and the actions continue to influence one another's lifetime at all times. Aggression and anger and the disharmony, lacking of peace and serenity in our lives are caused again by one's own actions. All of us are responsible for that. Peace and happiness, causes of all joyfulness, and genuine serenity and peacefulness arises also as the cause that is created, from the cause that is created between yourself and my own self. And therefore, if we take time to understand cause and effect, what we are creating among ourselves at each time, then it also begins to reflect into being able to see that the generation of awareness in one's own actions of body, speech, and mind becomes essential simply because if I do not generate that mindfulness of my own mind, then the actions are unimpeded. They are created at all times. That creation is happening at all times. And therefore, if the body would remain still, mind would remain still, speech would remain still, and not produce so many actions that would influence myself and the others, then perhaps we could say, I am not at this moment going to generate mindfulness and take my time to go through the transformation of my own attitude and refrain from understanding the essence of the teachings and continue to be the person that I am. But if we think from a logical perspective, simply because the movement of actions of the body, speech, and mind continue to flow, one can't wait until one feels ready to develop that mindfulness of the body, speech, and mind. And so who other than a meditator or a person who has met with any path of practice should be the one who understands better about the importance of generating awareness of one's own body, speech, and mind. And so being a dedicated meditator, but at the same time not going deep enough to see how much of the essence of that meditation are you putting into your own life, your own attitude of body, speech, and mind, actions of body, speech, and mind, that needs to be carefully thought about. If that mindfulness or the essence of the teachings is not implemented, then you are not implementing the essence or understanding the essence of the teachings, not bringing about the true transformation, and meanwhile continuing to create karma, continuing to create actions of body, speech, and mind. When you continue to create actions that are in contradiction to what you aspire, then we are walking in two different opposite directions, wanting something but doing the opposite of it. Wanting to meditate, and from meditation or any spiritual practice, gain happiness for oneself and for the others, fulfillment of one's own aspiration. But while longing for that, actions that we are created are in opposition to what we are aspiring. So as the simple logic goes, is you plant a lemon tree, you aspire for a mango fruit. You plant a lemon seed, you aspire for a mango fruit, isn't it? And so what is being planted? The simple logic of karma is what you are creating, that's going to determine the effect that you are going to enjoy or that you are going to be experiencing. And so therefore, meditation does come about where one then sees that if it is genuine happiness or genuine transformation of my mind, that is the reason why I am meditating. If again it is for the simple altruistic intention of benefiting all sentient beings and one's own self, bringing about cause of happiness for oneself and the others, that is the reason why one is meditating or entering into any spiritual path of practice, Buddhism or otherwise, then it becomes necessary to also sit down and see, what are you doing about it? Are you actually putting the essence into one's own attitude and bringing about the transitions in one's own attitude? And so for this person, two-person in the retreat cabins, quarreling with one another and absolutely disliking each other's habits. A clear example, a simple example, nevertheless, one can simply go to these people and say, well, that's precisely the reason why you are in retreat, is to go through the transformation of being able to look inwardly in one's own self and see what is that hatred or jealousy or aggression or attachment, self-attachment. That is the precise reason why you are in retreat. That is what needs to be changed. Changing others is going to take a long time. There is no time to go about trying to change everyone else in the world to perfectly be harmonious and keep quiet and still before one can change one's own self and give loving kindness to the others. Meditators often, I think, we tend to do that, is I'm willing to give loving kindness and compassion, selflessness to others as long as everyone behaves, as long as everyone is quiet, as long as everyone sort of maintains their distance and gives me the space that I require, then that's fine. So almost, not maybe in so many words, but that's the tendency that we do bring up. And so in terms of working with that difficulty, that which we want to be liberated or free from, the point is to come back into seeing oneself sitting in meditation and then beginning to see what needs to be changed, what needs to be transformed within one's own self. The popular anecdote within the sutra teachings where Shakyamuni Buddha talks about instead of carpeting the entire surface of the earth, would it not be a wiser thing to wear shoes or sandals on one's own feet rather than trying to carpet the entire surface of the world, fearing that thorns will pierce on one's own soul? And so it's quite the same thing that we bring about, is we want everyone to change according to my own expectations, and then I'm going to have selfless compassion for all sentient beings. That's not going to be possible. Change that must occur. Meditator, and why we refer to meditation, is that transformation and the perception that I have, that needs to go through the changes. And so from that, within this context, the teachings of the Mahayana talks about 4 simple generations or 4 simple awarenesses that can be developed in the mind stream of a meditator. They can be enumerated as the 4 immeasurable qualities that can be brought about in contemplative meditation if you need a reference, if you need a name. On the other hand, as I said, these 4 qualities are intrinsic qualities of each human being. 4 simple qualities arising in 4 simple aspirations. If you like aspirations and you like to make prayers, then you can make them. If you like Tibetan, you can say, and you can ask them to translate. Now, if you want to say it in English, may all sentient beings attain happiness and the cause of happiness. May all sentient beings be free from suffering and the cause of suffering. May all sentient beings never be separate from the happiness devoid of suffering. And may all sentient beings attain perfect equanimity. 4 simple aspirations. If you want to make aspirations in so many words, you can say them. If you want to compose your own, you can compose your own. Whatever inspires you, that's how it should be. In terms of sort of simple enumerations, these are referred to as the 4 boundless qualities or the 4 immeasurable qualities. Immeasurable loving kindness, immeasurable compassion for all sentient beings, immeasurable joyfulness, and immeasurable equanimity. Being able to work with these 4 simple qualities is said to be what is the first basis of the Mahayana teachings, the greater vehicle teachings that then direct to understanding selflessness. But on the other hand, one of the most challenging practices ever within the Buddhist practices. And so normally we often go through the very easy way of simple 4 immeasurable aspirations, and we wish all sentient beings to be happy, meet with the cause of happiness, not have suffering in the cause of suffering, never be separate from the happiness, free from suffering, and then genuinely aspire that all sentient beings attain perfect equanimity. But if we work with it thoroughly in our own meditation, these 4 thoughts become the most challenging, that allows the mind to go through the details of all that what we have been trying to speak about. And so if we say, how can I work with aggression? How can I work with desire and self-grasping, of ignorance, of all the various other tendencies or emotions, 84,000 as they are enumerated within Buddhist philosophy, or any difficulty, defilements, neurosis that we encounter? Practicing these 4 simple, boundless or immeasurable qualities can be very, very helpful. And so the first simple way of working with it, if you are meditators, then in any meditation posture that you are familiar with, you can precede it with all the preliminaries and visualizations, and especially generating the blessings of the Guru through the Guru Yoga practices. But those, again, since this is a public talk, keeping it very simply is sit for a brief moment and generate genuine loving kindness towards all sentient beings. How difficult can it be? Doesn't need history, doesn't need analysis, doesn't need a philosophy, doesn't need a technique. And if we want a technique, there are all kinds. I can probably sit down and then for the next 1 hour we could do breathe in, breathe out, and sometimes I do that, isn't it? Reflect on the in-breath, reflect on the out-breath. Now breathe in, hold it down on the belly. Now breathe out, say Om Ahum. Now visualize the Buddhas, now visualize the Bodhisattvas. In that complicated matter, if it inspires you, Saturday and Sunday we can do that. But at the same time, another way of looking at it is, as a human being, with that potential and quality of awareness and mindfulness that we have, if we look carefully from one perspective, we could say, is that if you were to talk about generating loving kindness towards all sentient beings, you could probably talk about it for a great amount of time. You could explain it to somebody else. Therefore, it is not so difficult to generate loving kindness. In meditation, sit for a brief while and generate boundless, immeasurable loving kindness towards all sentient beings. Now, when that is heard, and if you put that into practice, if you put that into meditation, sincerely, truthfully, with an honest approach, often what we will encounter is having no idea what we are talking about. We have some vague idea and the wish to generate loving kindness to the others. But what we will encounter first is that we don't even know who we mean when we say sentient beings. As meditators, when we sit and do these practices for all sentient beings through in many, many years, still there are moments when we sit in meditation and we say sentient beings. We have some vague idea that we do mean sentient beings who are all about the world in different forms and shapes and sizes. But another way of looking at it is oftentimes sentient beings are black burbs or black dots when we close our eyes. And we have no idea, no faces to them. We don't know who they are. And foremost of all, we don't know whether they are suffering or not. Then if we look carefully, we don't know what suffering is. And so from that, the first encounter that the meditation in reflecting in this way comes about is the understanding why it took for so many teachers and enlightened beings to actually compose volumes and volumes of teachings and texts explaining what suffering is, what sentient beings or who sentient beings are. And so we come up with the wise remark, especially those who are studying Buddhism often may have encountered the difficulties when the 6 realms are enumerated. And we talk about the 3 lower realms and the 3 higher realms. 3 lower realms talk about the hell realm, hungry ghost realm, and the semi-god or demigod animal realm, deva realm, and the human realm as the upper realms. And so oftentimes what we encounter is how can Buddhism talk about hell realm,